IMF, the International Monetary Fund, has been trying to push Africa, especially Sub-Saharan Africa, to be able to carry out reforms in terms of public management that will eventually see the rising up of the private sector or enhancing and empowering the private sector. This, of course, lots of recommendations have been given by the IMF and the World Bank to push this since in the 90s right up to early 2000s. Some of these recommendations, of course, when I do a little review in terms of what the push ahead in terms of policies are transparency and accountability. In terms of transparency and accountability, the IMF encourages member countries to improve accountability through disclosure in line with its transparency policy. The IMF conducts good governance diagnostics to analyze and recommend actions for addressing corruption and vulnerabilities and strengthening integrity and governance in member states or countries per se. To buttress the point, the World Bank views good governance as a crucial point for sustainable development. When we talk about sustainable development, she also reiterates about transparency in terms of public management. This, of course, in terms of long-term management principles that will see transparency. Both institutions, both the IMF and the World Bank, is for the fact that there should be decentralization moves that Sub-Saharan Africa is trying to carry forth. And this decentralization tendency, in many parts of Sub-Saharan Africa, they look at decentralization only on an executive branch per se. In other words, they tend to decongest the executive branch by adding branches and agencies that will reinforce management. But in the midst of all this, transparency, accountability is yet to come in its proper sense of view. Even though the IMF and the World Bank has not been so much of a stringent view for Africans, probably because I believe that it's a progressive democracy. But this, of course, in the 90s, right up to the early 2000s, where are we far from the aspect of good governance. In other words, what the IMF and the World Bank holds for Sub-Saharan Africa is that there should be decentralization in terms of democratic institutions. What I mean to say is that we have three main pillars that is in charge of good governance in terms of political science. These three main pillars are the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judiciary branch of every nation. This, of course, is supposed to be standard in terms of Republican values. Now, with what has been carried so far in many parts of Africa in terms of decentralization, is a matter of reinforcing or reiterating on the executive branch. Agencies have been created to do the checks and balances in terms of corruption, in terms of management. But then this is still far-fetched. Why? Because what the IMF and the World Bank is in search of for Sub-Saharan Africa, for a good sense of accountability and management and transparency per se, requires that the judicial, legislative, and the executive branch are completely independent from each other. Now, with that being said, it is easy to have a good sense of transparency in terms of public management. In other words, if I were to give an example in terms of transparency and independence in management, it will require that the judicial, that is in charge of the custodian to policies that watches over as the arm of execution is being carried on, while the legislator builds and beefs up the bills that are promulgated later on, it will require that the judicial be completely independent. How do I mean? In other words, what concerns these three pillars of democracy in terms of constitutional reforms in every Sub-Saharan nation should be that the articles that will guide the judicial, legislative and executive should have at least 100 years before ever thinking of a revision per se. In other words, articles, for example, that should see the protection of the judicial or the chief judge or those who will be in charge of the judiciary in nations of sub-Saharan Africa should be, which of course should be appointed or nominated, and once accepted by the parties in question, they should have a tenure for life. When I talk about a tenure for life or a term of office for life, it will mean that once appointed, forever appointed. The only thing that could take away the judicial or take away a chief judge from a nation in the sub-Saharan Africa will mean that conducts probably are poor and will lead to an impeachment by the legislation or the legislative arm, which means that it is not the executive that will take a signature to rig him off, but it will go to the legislative, and of course, a vote of confidence will be given. Or probably it will come based on the fact that he resigns on a personal base, per se. That said, there's a lot of security that is given to the judiciary, which of course will enable him to also check the executive and the legislature in return without any fear or constraint per se. On the other hand, the executive, of course, knows that if he's going to play foul, the judicial will pounce on him and will be able to bring the law to bear. The legislative, of course, on the other hand, there continues to pass the laws and promulgate laws and ignite the laws with the executive based on the fact that the arms of transparency and accountability in terms of democratic pillars, which are the legislative, the executive, and the judicial, has at least 100 years, or probably it will come based on the fact that he resigns on a personal base, per se. That said, there's a lot of security that is given to the judiciary, which of course will enable him to also check the executive and the legislature in return without any fear or constraint per se. On the other hand, the executive, of course, knows that if he's going to play foul, the judicial will pounce on him and will be able to bring the law to bear. The legislative, of course, on the other hand, there continues to pass the laws and promulgate laws and ignite the laws with the executive based on the fact that the arms of transparency and accountability in terms of democratic pillars, which are the legislative, the executive, and the judicial, has at least 100 years before it is revised. Then we can have other little legislative or subsection to articles that could be revised after 1 or 2 years. That which I mean is in terms of grocery, in terms of taxations, in terms of import and export analysis along the way. That, of course, we all agree that the changes of weather will warrant that to this season, as we do migrate, we'll probably need some amendments along the way, but not the three M's of good governance. The three M's of good governance will remain the checks and balances that will bring separation and decentralization to what the World Bank and the IMF has been looking for to fight corruption, embezzlement, mismanagement, or bring a sense of transparency in terms of public management. Also giving a sense to the private sector to rise and boost management in public space. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to our review. The very fabrics of democracy and good governance, which is the legislative arm, the executive arm, and the judiciary, must be protected in terms of constitutional reforms for the next 100 years, never be revised per se. This will demand that those arms are completely independent from each other and can do the checks and balances per se. In other words, even if a head of state or a chief executive officer deems it necessary to handle public office, he should have a tenure or a mandate that probably will take 4 years or 5 years per a mandate and could have at most 2 mandates per se. One has 8 years or 10 years to exhaust all what he knows in terms of management and so be able to step down for a next person to take over. Yes, for a start, I think that that's what Africa needs. Even if you have people who can do good management and extreme management, vulnerability, and the way Africa stands now, it is important to note that you do your own path and play your own role very well, and then you go for a next person to take over. You might not know how important the strengths and weaknesses of the next person could look like. Opportunities are developed much more when the legislative, of course, bills, laws, and put forth articles in the Constitution that will limit the mandate of the executive and, of course, empower the judicial to be able to do the checks and balances as the custodian to the law. These are the reforms that the World Bank and the IMF is in search of in Sub-Saharan Africa or in Africa as a whole. It has come to the point whereby, in such a constitutional reforms for where checks and balances and transparency becomes inevitable, it is important to know that in terms of these democratical pillars, the very fabrics of democracy, which is the legislative, the judiciary, and the executive arm, laws that should be ignited within these arms in order to do the checks and balances for the executive should warrant that a 4 years or 5 years first mandate and at most 2 mandates be given to the executive to max out its portfolio. Very important. No matter how generous that chief executive officer could be or that head of state should be, we have to agree that space must be created for many more people to arise and assume responsibilities. Now, on the other hand, we sometimes fall prey to the fact that you have the public opinion that is encouraging the executive to be in power beyond what is needed. Come to it why the checks and balances of the 3 pillars of democracy is very vital and very important. In such a case whereby the public opinion, when you sample public opinion and they tell you that it is important for the head of state stand again and keep standing again for election, there it calls for the judiciary to sanction the legislative based on what has been enacted and kept in terms of custody. In other words, they have the right to silence the legislative and to make the legislative understand that she can bypass the very fabrics of what has been decided upon for good governance. Now, we're able to see a head of state or a chief executive officer who is so vibrant and so strong, age-wise, intelligent enough, be able to act as a mentor or a coach to the next person that may love to come in. That begins to explain. Legislative, checks and balances from the judicial. You want to keep staying there because you have public opinion. They say no. The judicial says no. The executive probably does not have public opinion as a support and yet wants to stay in place. The judicial comes and hits in and says, the roundup here, the raison d'etre is that you have to respect the constitution of the country without any fear or constraint, of course. And then on the other hand, the judicial can always step down if and only if there is a character problem. And this will only come from the legislative, not from the executive that sits up and signs a letter of sack. That was it in terms of the very fabrics of democratic institutions with an impetus to transparency and accountability. Very important as we tend to respect and see a real sense of development in Sub-Saharan Africa or in Africa entirely or in, of course, developing countries. With that, of course, we're set to go in terms of real sense of management and development. Bye for now, but hope to hear from you soonest. Political leadership to many African leaders, we use so much into the very fabrics of democracy or good governance that leads to transparency and accountability. To some, it's a witch hunt. They feel that you hate them or you're against them. Well, that's not really true. It's about dealing with issues that will avoid public embarrassments, coup d'etat, hysterias that could develop, infringements in terms of policies and investments per se, and you have foreigners finding it difficult to invest in your country and what have you. Political leadership shouldn't be a witch hunt, neither should it be looked upon as hatred and have a psychopathic feeling in relation to that, but rather should be looked upon as a game. In the West, politics is looked upon as a game whereby each and every one has the freedom to express himself and take upon the challenge. Whereas in many parts of Sub-Saharan Africa, it's a witch hunt, it's hatred, what have you. And in all these places where the very fabrics of good governance, democracy, transparency, and accountability, the checks and balances are not there, you can actually see the pace of development. It's quite slow. You get to their airports, to their streets, everything reflects what is just the very opposite of what we don't want to see. But of course, we have to answer the question if that's the very nation where we want our children to grow and investments should come to place. We should be able to agree on the fact that we don't want our children to die in the highway, neither should they be looked upon in foreign nations as men and women that don't have a strength back at home. It's very difficult when you're labeled to be otherwise in a foreign nation. China today feels much better in the Western world because she's developed her economy. We too, our Africans have to think in a much better way to see that they gain respect each time they travel and move in and out of airports around the world.